Hello everyone, welcome to What If Luffy and Crew Time Travel to Different Timeline Part 1. Before we start, please go support CHESHIERCATT805 for writing that awesome fanfic. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. I promised, when we first met, that I would pay at the end of your blade if I ever got in the way of your dream. Kneeling in the several-inch deep mud, the man bowed his head to show his respects, gratitude and apology, overwhelming him as he cried softly to his fallen friend. The raven-haired man gently placed 3 blades on the ground, as if they would shatter if he moved too quickly. You died for mine, so I guess that counts as getting in the way. He sat in the mud for several long hours, unbothered by the elements that tried to hide the swords. He didn't care about anything other than the grave in front of him. He briefly scoffed at himself as he knelt there. He didn't stay in front of his other friends' graves for nearly as long as he was this one. Maybe it was because Zorro was the first one to join him on his journey, or maybe it was because Zorro was the only one who hadn't tried to kill or betray him at any point. He didn't know, and he didn't want to think about it. All he wanted to do was sit there and grieve. Oh, I bid farewell to the port and the land. He'd never been much of a singer, but he'd make an exception, and I paddle away from brave England's white sands, to search for my long ago forgotten friends, to search for the place I hear all sailors end. Almost comforting, the wind seemed to warm and wrap around him as he sang between sobs, as the souls of the dead fill the space of my mind, I'll search without sleeping till peace I can find. I fear not the weather, I fear not the sea. I remember the fallen, do they think of me? When their bones in the ocean forever will be. His crying soon overpowered his singing. He couldn't continue on as thoughts and memories of their time spent together overtook his mind. Though, the rain let up almost completely. He was almost startled by the sound of bushes rustling behind him. Whoever it was obviously knew that he wasn't in the right state of mind to sense anything, so they made as much noise as they could without being disrespectful. The raven-haired man was grateful for that. Luffy? The person called out, his nadachi resting across his back instead of its normal place on his shoulder. He didn't want it to get in the way of comforting his friend. You've been here for almost a day and you haven't moved. You should come inside with me and the others. Not even lifting his head, Luffy asked, others? His expression softened as the taller squatted beside the shorter. Yeah, Kid and Bonney got here a few hours ago. Marco and Shanks should be arriving with Mihawk in a few minutes. When Luffy didn't make any signs of moving, he sighed and stood up. You'll get sick if you wait out here any longer. Law. Luffy spoke just as Law took off his coat to drape it over the younger male. Am I a bad person? Dropping his coat over the young man, Law looked slightly shocked. What? No. What brought this on? Instead of answering, Luffy simply started to mumble the words of the song again, plot a course to the night, to a place I once knew, to a place where my hope died along with my crew. So I swallow my grief and face life's final test. To find promise of peace and the solace of rest. Law could only look at his friend in pity as he joined in singing, as the songs of the dead fill the space of my ears, their laughter like children, their beckoning cheers. My heart longs to join them, sing songs of the sea. I remember the fallen, do they think of me? Law idly noticed that Luffy had cried himself to sleep. So, he picked up his fellow and started the small trek back to the small house he'd built, when their bones in the ocean forever will be. Law. Called Bonney as he neared the small house. It wasn't the best looking thing, but it served its purpose of keeping its occupant safe from the elements. Besides, it was built to only last a few days at most, not a few weeks. It was a miracle it was still standing. SHH, the tall man shushed her, he hasn't slept in a few days. He walked into the house and passed Bonney and Kid. He then laid the young captain on the small couch across from the lit fireplace. The other 3 will be here soon, we should probably get ready to greet them. Kid scoffed, what have we come to? What do you mean? Bonney asked. I mean, Kid glared, that we used to be great captains. Our names alone used to strike fear into those that heard. And now we're hiding from everything because of a stupid mistake. Well, Law snapped, that stupid mistake cost us everything we had. Our friends, our families, and our crews are all gone. Breathing deeply, he compassed himself quickly as he walked back over to open the door and let Shanks and Marco. He briefly let himself wonder where the third was before accepting the worst into their small house. Hiding is the only thing keeping you safe. If you don't like it, you can leave whenever you want. Before Bonney, who had become the mother of the group after the other girls had died, could scold either of them, the door was opened and the 2 old era pirates walked into the haphazard building. Together, they gauged the situation and the setting. No one said a word as Shanks walked past them all and over to where Luffy was laying. He had woken up just after Kid had started complaining, but he didn't have the energy or care to move. He just stared at the slowly dying fire, lost in thoughts. Hey Luffy. Shanks sat in front of the boy, interrupting his line of sight and forcing Luffy to look at him. How you doing, kid? His voice was soft. It was odd for the others to hear him like that. They're gone. Was all the raven-haired man, though he looked more like a boy in the eyes of everyone present, said. Shanks knew exactly who he was talking about. Though, the fact that neither he nor Marco could sense any of Luffy's crew should have given them their answer. That meant that these four barely adults, Law being the oldest at 28, Bonney following at 26, then Kid at 25 and Luffy at 21, were now alone. They only had each other now, but they had all been enemies only 2 years beforehand. It's scary how much war changes. I'm sorry, Luffy. The redhead said. He knew how this dare he called him his. Kid was feeling. After all, he felt pretty similar when his own captain died. How did you do it? Luffy asked. How'd I do what? How'd you get over Roger's death? The question took Shanks by surprise, so he had to take a few seconds to answer. I didn't. Was his answer. I still think about him, even today. It was another few minutes of looking at each other with empty eyes before Shanks spoke again. The death of a crew member of a family member is the hardest thing to get over. But, you can't let yourself drown in your sadness. What would your crew do if they saw you like this? That made Luffy go to a slightly different thought process. What would his crew do? Brook would probably play some music to try and cheer him up, Usopp and Chopper would start up a game of tag or hide and seek, Frankie would show off whatever he had been working on, Sanji would make him food, probably meat or ramen, Robin would ask him about his home, even if he'd already told her everything there was to know about his home, Jin would tell him stories about his old captain, Zoro would let him take a nap on his lap. It wasn't much, but they all did something special that made him feel better whenever they caught it. Though, there were times when he just needed to be left alone, and they all gave him that space. This train of thought made Luffy start crying. He missed his crew. They had been there for him almost every time he needed them after he set off, so not having them with him was like ripping out a vital organ. Slowly, Luffy rolled off of the couch he laid on and hugged Shanks. It was the first time since Jin died that he felt the embrace of a parent-like figure. Go ahead, Shanks rubbed the small raven-haired man's back, let it all out. It's okay, I'm here, Marco's here, Law and Kid and Bonney are here. Marco ushered the three younger pirates out of the house and into the forest. He wanted to give the two some space, per Shanks' unspoken request. He also wanted to talk to these three and get a plan set up before Luffy and Shanks joined them. After all, the sooner they got everything figured out, the sooner they could be safe. What do you propose we do? Law asked a former first mate of the Whitebeard pirates. This is gonna sound crazy, the blonde started, but was cut off. What about this whole situation isn't crazy? Kid mumbled. Marco didn't miss a beat as he continued, but I suggest we travel through time. It was silent for a few seconds before Kid and Bonney started to laugh. Yeah. Bonney said between her giggles, that does sound crazy. We appreciate you and Old Man Red coming all this way, but getting our hopes up with an impossibility like that isn't something I'll tolerate. Kid said, stargely serious. It was curious for Marco to see how protective the group had become of each other in the short time span of being stuck together. Marco, however, didn't dwell on his observations of the three. Instead, he told them that what he's suggesting isn't a ploy to eventually crush their trust and hope in him. Me and Shanks found something on our way here. It was floating in the wreckage of an old marine ship that was stirred up during a storm a few days ago. I looked into it and it looks like time travel. If you want to check it out, be my guest. The three looked at each other in consideration. If they did end up looking over it, then Luffy would have to be there with them. No matter how much they didn't like the fact at first, Luffy had actually seen the treasure Captain Gold D. Roger left behind and was therefore the Pirate King. They'd be damned if they made a huge decision like this without him present. Law voiced their silent conversation and decision to Marco, who nodded. It was a respectable choice, and he acknowledged it as such. Besides, that's how things were done on the Moby Dick, no decision was made without all of the commanders on the ship and the captain present. When Luffy was done crying into the shoulder of his childhood hero and biggest influence, he sat back and apologized. Sorry, he looked away as he wiped his eyes, I didn't mean to get your shirt all wet. Don't apologize for crying. The redhead ruffled the younger's raven hair, besides, it's fine. The two sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes before the both started to get restless. You want to help me make something to eat? Luffy offered. It had taken a long time, but Sanji had somehow taught Luffy how to cook over something that wasn't a campfire. Though, fire was still his favorite way to cook stuff. Nothing beats the fresh scent of campfire smoke on clothes or the taste of charcoal peppered on a hunk of meat. Sure. Shanks agreed. It was a slight shock that Luffy knew how to cook, but they got the meal prepared and ready for themselves, as well as the others. There wasn't a lot to begin with, so they didn't have a huge meal. Halfway through cooking the small meal, Luffy briefly noticed that one person was missing. Shanks. He asked, suddenly very nervous to ask, where's Mihawk? I thought he was supposed to come with you guys. Shanks didn't give away any emotion as he busied himself with setting the table, he should be here in the morning. Luffy didn't find much hope in the redhead's words, though he didn't say anything. The set table and the two laughing adults is what Marco, Law, Bonney and Kid walked in on. It made each of them happy, seeing the normal bowl of sunshine slowly recovering. Though they knew that he still needed time to grieve, they all took at least a week when their own crews died, they were just happy to have him smiling again. None of them, especially Kid, would admit it, but they were all scared that Luffy wouldn't ever recover. Then again, none of them would ever be able to recover from the deaths of their crews. I didn't know you could cook. Marco smiled as he sat at the table. Luffy nodded and sat, too. Yeah, Sanji taught me how to cook on a stove a while ago. But cooking over a campfire will always be my favorite way to cook. Why a campfire? Bonney asked, taking a bite of her food. They all knew that food was a precious resource at the moment, so they all limited themselves, but no one wasted a crumb. Back just after Shanks left my home island, Gramps made me live with mountain bandits. He was suddenly quiet before he whispered, I wonder how they're doing. The rest of dinner was quiet but not uncomfortable. It wasn't until after all of the dishes had been cleared, not a scrap of food wasted, that they decided to bring up the time travel again. When Marco and Shanks explained it again, the three who'd already heard about it looked at Luffy. Whatever he said, they would follow. Not all of them would be happy about it, but they would all do what Luffy said. I think, the Pirate King said after a moment of thought, that we should try it. He waited a second before he gave his simple reasoning, if there's a chance that we can prevent any of this from happening, then I want to try it. Agreeing with his reasoning, the group of 6 began to plan their next few moves. We'll have to do this as soon as possible, Marco said, now taking charge of the situation. I say we do it tomorrow morning, tomorrow evening at the latest. And if we're successful? Law asked, then what? Shanks smiled as he answered, now's when the fun planning begins. If I'm right, then whatever it is will take us back to a time where we either died temporarily or were close enough to death to be considered dead. For myself, it'll be about 3 years after Captain Roger was executed. Going by that, I'll go back until just after Shanks was named Yonko. Marco added. I'll be 12. Law stated. 13, I think. Bonney frowned. 15. Kid scoffed. 7. Luffy said. It concerned Marco and Shanks that the 4 were not only barely in their double digits, but that they also had to think about their answer. Though Luffy's age was the most concerning, no one said anything. Wait, Shanks looked at Luffy, weren't you 7 when I docked on your island? Yep. Luffy smiled, but he didn't say anything more on the matter, and the others let it drop. We should probably figure out how old everyone will be when we can all meet up. Law suggested, I'm 2 years older than Bonney, she's 1 year older than Kid, and he's 4 years older than Luffy. Taking a second to do the quick calculations in his mind, Law gave them their answer, us 4 should meet up when we're 18, 16, 15 and 12 respectively. He then turned his direct attention to Shanks, how old were you when Roger died? Then he turned to Marco, and how old were you when Shanks was named Yonko? I was 15 when my captain was executed. I was 37 when this idiot finally made a name for himself. Law gave the small jab no attention as he took the information and ran another few calculations in his head. Then that means Shanks will be sent back before any of us, and Marco will be the last one to arrive. At his point he was almost muttering to himself, but the others made sure to pay close attention. Luffy and Shanks will have already met before Luffy gets there. He trailed off once again before giving his final answer, in order of Marco, Shanks, myself, Bonney, Kid and Luffy. 39, 35, 22, 20, 19, and 15 are the ages we'll have to be before we can meet up as a group. The other 5 were shocked. Not only was this the most he had spoken in a while, almost a full year, but they were also taken aback at the fact he calculated that all in his head. Even Marco, though he won't ever admit it, wouldn't be able to do that fast without writing it down. Recovering quickly, the Phoenix spoke again, we should hold off on the actual meet-up until after Luffy sets off. Before anyone could protest, he held up his hand to silence them. Shanks will be in charge of getting Luffy his den number when they first meet, even though present Luffy won't be there yet. Law, Bonney, Kid and Luffy will wait until you all get to Sabati before you meet up. I'll give myself a mission in the East Blue and get Luffy my personal den number. Does that make sense? He sighed at the blank looks he received before he started to explain again, trying to simplify his words. Shanks. You will need to give your den number to Luffy at the same time you give him your hat. I will get a mission to the East Blue before or when Luffy sets off and give him my personal den number. Law, Bonney, Kid, Luffy. You 4 will wait until you reach the Sabati archipelago before interacting with each other. Is that understood? This time, he was glad to get nods and noises of confirmation. That's a good plan and all, Kid spoke up, but that's all based on the fact that we'll end up at the earliest time we all almost died. What if that doesn't happen? What if we're all thrown into different times? The group was sent back into silence as they thought it over. Kid brought up a good point, but they didn't have an answer for him. All they could do was hope that everything went according to plan for once. Shanks quietly knocked on the wooden table. It'll be good to have a backup plan. Bonney said, just in case. She waited for a minute for the men to present any ideas. When no one spoke up, she did. If what kid says happens, and we all end up at different times that don't correlate with the plan, then we hope that one of us gets there before we all make it to the new world. If that happens, then they are in charge of giving their den number to the others when we reach Sabati. Shanks and Marco, though, will have to find us on their own and exchange den numbers. From there, we'll be able to communicate and plan an official meetup. The males all nodded. It's a good backup plan. With 2 plans now in place, they could start getting ready to leave. Are we going to tell our crews? Luffy spoke up for the first time since the beginning of their meeting. At their surprised looks and silence, Luffy repeated his question, are we going to tell our crews? I think, Shanks took in a deep breath, ignoring Kid's snigger of that's dangerous, I think we should only tell a handful of people. I'll tell Ben, Marco, you should tell Whitebeard, you 4 should only tell your vice captains. After a moment of thinking, he said, if worse comes to worse, we tell our whole crews. Though, that shouldn't happen. Deciding to change the topic slightly, Luffy spoke again, we're going back to try and prevent this whole thing from happening, right? How will we do that? Is it simply a matter of being in the right place at the right time? That got everyone thinking. Though, that was their best answer. Simply be in the right place and the right time. Make ourselves an inconvenience to our enemies. Yeah, that sounded a lot more fun than what they initially thought. If something happens that we can't prevent, I say we tell a few influential pieces on our chessboard. Kid brought up, for example. Rayleigh, Dragon and Jin should be told at some point. I agree. Marco said, but only unless we all agree that the time is right to tell them. Other than that, we don't tell them. Luffy was going to ask another question, but he kept it to himself. He had no doubts that Robin would find out eventually, based solely on his behavior. She was smart, so he knew she'd figure him out. There was a small, irrational part of his brain set aside for paranoia that told him his crew would leave him for dead not if they found out he was really from the future and he had already failed them once before. He distantly realized he had sent himself into a panic attack that the others hadn't noticed yet. Only when the others had left to go start mentally preparing themselves for their trip did Marco let his concern for Luffy skyrocket. He had noticed about 5 minutes before everyone dismissed that the youngest's breathing pattern had changed into one that usually indicated panic. His unfocused eyes and the slight shaking in his hands told Marco that the boy man, he was reminding himself, had ended up in a panic attack somehow. He was glad, however, that he'd been there when it happened. After all, he had extensive medical knowledge and was best equipped to handle this, aside from Law, but the doctor had already worried about Luffy enough. Luffy. He waved his hand in front of the younger's eyes in order to gauge how bad this was. When Luffy showed no signs of noticing him, Marco continued to try different ways to pull him out of his panic state. Eventually, he landed upon a hug. Luffy has always been one for physical touch and affection. It may seem weird to other people, but knowing someone is near is not as comforting as feeling someone near. It's why he's always jumping on people and getting in their personal space. It's also why he's so fond of animals. Being able to touch someone means that he can feel that person is alive and breathing. But, while it's his biggest comfort, it's also his biggest discomfort. After the War of the Best, Luffy didn't want anyone to touch him. He was scared that they'd die in his arms, just like Ace did. It took 2 years, but he was finally mostly over it. Occasionally though, it reappears and he doesn't let anyone touch him. So, when he felt something warm and soft, almost feathery brush against his face, he snapped out of whatever trance he was in and stared at the bird in front of him. Marco didn't go into his full phoenix form much anymore, but knowing Luffy for a little over 2 years and knowing of him for a lot longer than that gave him the idea that physical touch will help him. When the hug didn't work, the blonde decided to go full phoenix and hoped that the healing aspect of his feather-like flames would help the raven-haired man. When it worked, he gave himself a mental pat on the back and allowed a small smile to show to Luffy. Marco only transformed several minutes later when he knew that Luffy was back in a good as it could be, considering mental place. We'll go over everything again tomorrow morning before we leave. Why don't you get some rest? Luffy numbly nodded, the wish that Marco were still in phoenix form pushed into the back of his mind. Though he was told to get some rest, Luffy instead took his coat and left the building. He was still covered in mud from the rainstorm hours earlier, but he didn't care. All he did was throw his coat over his shoulders and walk back to where his friends were marked as memories. As if he was used to it, Luffy went to each of the 9 graves and cleared their precious items of as much of the mud as he could. Jin had a black flag with the mark of the Sun Pirates on one side and the mark of the Straw Hat Pirates on the other. Brooke had his violin and bow. Frankie had a hammer and a bottle of cola. Robin had her journal and a piece of a poneglyph. Topper had his hat and his grinding bowl. Sanji had a pack of cigarettes and his best kitchen knife. Usopp had his goggles and his slingshot. Nami had her map and a pinwheel. Zorro had his 3 swords and a bottle of sake. All of the headstones sat under one of the orange trees he'd managed to get off the sunny before it sank. Of course, his 2 ships had their own markers. The Mini Mary was in place of the Going Merry, and the swing hanging from the branches of the tree had a model of the Sunny and a bottle sitting on it. There was only one grave left, but it held no markers to tell who it belonged to. Luffy sat in front of the unmarked grave and continued his ghostly song. When at last before my ghostly shipmates I stand, I shed a small tear for my home upon land. Though their eyes speak of depths filled with struggle and strife, their smiles below say I don't owe them my life. He took the ship's log out of his coat pocket and leaned it against the empty headstone before he continued, the souls of the dead fill the space of my eyes, and my boat listed over and tried to capsize. I'm this far from drowning, this far from the sea. I remember the fallen, do they think of me? When my bones in the ocean forever will be. Luffy took off his captain's coat and threw it over the previously unmarked grave. Now that I'm staring down at the darkest abyss, I'm not sure what I want, but I don't think it's this. As my comrades call to stand fast and forge on, I make sail for the dawn till the darkness has gone. Next, he placed the red Sakazuki cups he kept in his pocket down in front of the grave. As the souls of the dead live forever in my mind, as I live all the years that they left me behind, I'll lay on the shore but still gaze at the sea. I remember the fallen and they think of me, for our souls in the ocean together will be. He stood and bowed to all of the graves, showing his respect for all of them, as well as his gratitude. I remember the fallen, and they think of me, for our souls in the ocean together will be. Chapter 2. Back to the past. Mihawk arrived the next morning, looking as if he'd just waltzed with death. Luffy normally would have laughed and said that that's not a good look on him, but this was not a normal circumstance. Instead, he opted to run up to help him. He was the only one outside of the house, so he was the first to see the former and present greatest swordsman. What happened? Luffy asked, he's never been one to beat around the bush. Despite his injuries, Mihawk smirked, as straightforward as ever, I see. He gladly accepted the young man's help as he hobbled to the barely standing, but safe, building. I had to take care of some pests that were following Shanks, Marco and myself. They were a bit more than I expected, but I handled them in the end. Luffy nodded as he sat the older man on the couch in front of the fire, setting his now broken black blade beside the man and taking his coat. The man was soaked through to the bone, so Mihawk was glad when Luffy handed him a towel to dry off with. He even let the ghost of a smile show to the captain. Mihawk. Shanks cheered when he saw the man sitting on the couch, you finally made it. No one addressed the relief clearly showing on his face and body language at the sight of the man. They all knew that it was a low chance of survival in groups and an even lower chance alone. Of course I did, you idiot. I had to make sure that you bunch of idiots didn't do anything stupid. He set the towel on the arm of the chair and put his hat back on as Bonney and Marco arrived to take care of his wounds. If you have a plan to leave, you should execute it sooner rather than later, they're getting closer and closer to this place. Everyone stiffened at his words, and Luffy felt a sense of dread fall over him. He didn't let anyone know, but he still felt even after 2 years that this whole mess was his fault. If only he hadn't fired on that damn celestial dragon. We've got a plan in place. Kid unknowingly pulled Luffy out of a terrible rabbit hole before he dove too deep. Yes, Marco said, you want to be a part of it. If it's not too much trouble. The swordsman nodded. Sighing, Law grumbled about having to redo calculations. Luffy looked as his friend and first ally in sympathy. He would help, but he knew he wouldn't be able to. One of the things he couldn't do was run complicated things in his head or at all. In the middle of a fight, sure. When he's not full of adrenaline, no. Besides, the complicated stuff was always handled by Robin or Jin. There are 2 plans, Shanks explained to his friend and rival. The first is the most complicated and works for the best situation. The second is less complicated, but is for the worst case scenario. Mihawk nodded along, not saying anything as the 4 supernovas moved to continue whatever they were doing before. How old were you when you first almost died? Mihawk blinked at the question, but answered regardless, I was about 14. He was weak when he was a child and had only come close to death 4 times after that. 3 of those times had been pushed to the back recesses of his mind, not forgotten, mind you, but the last time was just before he arrived at this island. He didn't mention any of that, though. Nodding, Shanks continued, in order of everyone arriving in the past. You, me, Law, Bonney, Kid, Luffy, Marco. Plan A, with you added, should go something like this. Me and you will both be in the past by the time of our first meet-up in paradise. We'll exchange den numbers. Then, I'll meet Luffy before he arrives and give him both of our den numbers at the same time I give him my hat. When he sets off, Law, Kid, Bonney and Luffy will all be in the past by the time they reach Sabati for the first time and we'll meet up there. Marco will be the last one to get there, so we're going to wait to meet up until he gets there. When he does arrive, he'll find us on his own and we'll all exchange den numbers. He let his rival absorb the information before he finished the first explanation. In order to prevent anything like this from happening again, we're simply going to be an inconvenience to our enemies. Mihawk let a smile slip at that. He'd never heard right time, right place worded like that. He had the strange feeling that Luffy was responsible for the wording. Shanks noticed the small smile and smirked. He knew repeating Luffy's words would get a reaction out of the stoic swordsman. Plan B is based on the assumption that we won't be thrown back to when we were first close to death and that we'll instead be thrown to a random point in time. We'll have to hope that one of the four they both knew exactly who the four are will be taken to before they enter the new world. Whoever it is will be in charge of getting everyone's den numbers. Me, you and Marco, though, we'll have to find them on our own. Mihawk listened intently and absorbed all of the information given to him. These weren't the best plans, especially the second one, but they'd work. He still couldn't quite get his head around time travel, but that wasn't a pressing thought at the moment. Instead, he asked the redhead if they had a code word. When asked what he meant, he sighed and said, a code word or phrase, just to make sure that we've all arrived. We didn't think of that. Marco walked back into the room, but that'd be a good idea. He then walked out and called everyone back into the building. When everyone was there, he repeated what the hatted swordsman had said. What if we use inconvenience to our enemies? Or some variation? Bonney suggested. He'd scoffed but said nothing. It wasn't the best thing to say, and he would feel stupid saying it, but it would work. Law and Luffy shared their agreement. When it was decided that the phrase inconvenience to our enemies would be used whenever they met, they decided the reaction would be only in the best of ways. It's decided, then. Law spoke up, when we all arrive in the past, we will use the call and response to make sure we're all here. Marco, who had been the one to pull the chest from the wreckage and bring up the time travel, walked into the middle of the room and opened the chest for the second time. This is what we found. He pulled something out of the bottom of the chest and held it up for everyone in the room to see. It was a beautiful copper and silver astrolabe pendant on a silver chain. A pearl sat in the middle of the necklace. The moving pieces of round copper rings sat atop a silver map of the stars. Numerals in several different languages that none of them recognized decorated each of the inner, moving rings. The smallest ring and the biggest ring both moved in a counterclockwise motion only, while the middle-sized one moved in a clockwise motion. Encompassing the moving rings and the pearl was another copper ring that didn't move. The outer copper ring had signs of the 12 stars carved into it. Keeping everything together was a silver ring with 3 loops at the top. It's beautiful. Bonney said, and all of them agreed. As pirates, they naturally like shiny things and like to take what they think is valuable. The only two not entirely affected by this mindset were Mihawk and Luffy. Mihawk because he just didn't care about treasure, and Luffy because that's not what he thinks true treasure is. Marco, still holding the pendant, asked if everyone was ready to go. After nods of affirmation, Shanks reviewed the plans one last time. Gathering in a circle, Marco held the necklace away from himself and towards the middle of the group. Then, he had Luffy read the engraving on the box. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, all at once, a bright light overcame them all. Before anyone could react, they all blacked out. When he woke up, Luffy was overtaken with pain. He wondered for a quick second what exactly was happening, but that was quickly thrown out when he realized that the world shouldn't be upside down. Forget it. He heard a voice he hadn't heard in a very long time shout, "Get my sword." He realized he must have blacked out or that his heart briefly stopped so he could take over this body. Now that was kind of a scary thought. Too weak to do anything in the state that he was in, he let everything play out how he remembered it to. Though he was used to blood and being threatened and almost dying, he could never get used to the feeling of utter helplessness. Just like last time, the wall burst inwards as his not yet brothers came to his rescue. He almost started to sob when Ace said that he never backs down. He really did start sobbing when Sabo dropped him to go to Ace. He managed to cover his tears, though, with the story that he was scared and in pain. He didn't stop crying until they were back in the forest. "That's a nasty habit you've got, Ace." Sabo scolded his friend of 6 years. Ace just ignored him. "It just doesn't feel right." In the silence of the cliff they sat by, Luffy tried to get himself to stop crying. It didn't work very well, though. He just couldn't help it. Ace had died in his arms 4 years ago, and Sabo had died in front of him a year ago. He was slightly overwhelmed at seeing them, though he should be glad. He has a second chance. He can save them both. That's when something dawned on him. Before he could check his hat for Shanks or Mihawk's den number, Ace grabbed his attention. "Quit crying." The 10-year-old yelled as he jumped off the boulder he was sitting on, "I hate crybabies." Sniffling, he managed to slow his crying, but the tears still fell silently. There wasn't much he could do about that, though. So, he opted to say, "I'm not a crybaby." Sabo glanced at him with a look of obvious disbelief while Ace said, "Yes you are." "Yeah?" Luffy challenged, vaguely remembering what to say here in order for it to go as it had before. "Have you ever been punched with a spiked glove?" He barely noticed the flinch both the older boys gave at the reminder of what they just saved him from. "He's just being thankful." Sabo jumped back to the topic, "Give him a break." Ace just scoffed. "Why didn't you tell them where we hid the money?" It would have saved you a lot of trouble. I thought that if I told them, you wouldn't want to be my friend." His voice cracked when he said that. Ace had been in his life for so long that he couldn't even fathom a life where he wasn't with him. Though, he knew that wouldn't happen. Not if he could help it. The look of surprise flashed across his face as the kid spoke. "Why do you want to be my friend anyway?" Ace didn't know how to react to this kid. "I gave you such a hard time, why follow me?" Luffy almost hesitated as he spoke, because there's nobody else. The two older boys looked surprised at his words. "I can't go back to Fuchsia village and I hate mountain bandits." He let himself breath before he continued, "If I didn't follow you, then I would have been all alone." Before either of the other boys could interrupt, Luffy hammered the final nail into the coffin, and being alone hurts worse than being hurt. Neither 10-year-old knew exactly how much emotion had been put into those words, but it hit them hard. Ace folded his arms and asked softly, "What about your parents?" "Gramps is all I have. Is it easier for you when I'm around?" "Yeah." "Is it hard without me?" "Yeah." Sabo looked at his friend in pity. He knew what the next question was gonna be. Though, he was overly curious about this kid's answer. "Do you want me to live?" The look on Luffy's face showed absolute offense, as if he was insulted that Ace would think he didn't like him. "Of course I do." The conviction in his voice left no room for either of the older boys to doubt him. "Okay." Ace said, turning away from him, "But I don't like spoiled kids like you." When Luffy denied the fact that he was spoiled, he and Ace butted heads. He was so lost in the useless argument that he could almost forget his brother had died in his arms when he was 17. "This is great and all." Sabo interrupted the two raven-haired boys, "But I've got a real problem here." When the two idiots gave him their attention, he continued, "Where am I supposed to live? Blue Jam is gonna have his goons crawling in Middle Forest and the Great Terminal looking for us. What if I get attacked while I'm asleep?" The three stood in thought for a few minutes before Luffy suggested Sabo come live with him and Ace. They all grinned at the idea and went running towards the rundown hut. Luffy pushed aside the thoughts of what happened to his bandit family and his brothers. He just wanted to relish in the feeling that his brothers are here, the bandits are here, no one is going anywhere for a long time. It wasn't until his brothers had fallen asleep that he checked his hat for the den numbers Shanks should have given him. He grew nervous when he couldn't find them at first. Just as the doom that they'd have to use Plan B settled in his stomach, he found a tiny piece of paper. Sighing, he pulled it out, unfolded it, read the two numbers and put it back in its place before falling asleep next to his brothers. It was surreal, waking up next to his not-yet brothers. Though, he didn't wake them up yet. He liked Dayton's reaction to Sabo, and he unashamedly wanted to see it again. So, he laid back down and pretended to sleep. About an hour later, the ginger-haired woman came into the room and stared in surprise. 1, 2, 3 huh? She counted several more times. Ace, Luffy, huh? Before she gave herself a headache, she yelled at the two boys sent by Garp to live with her, Ace. Luffy. Who is this? Luffy sat up first, huh? Who's who? Then, he fell back into his fake sleep. Next was Ace, you're too loud. He, too, fell back to sleep. Sabo, however, got up, which got the other two to finally wake themselves fully. I'm Sabo. Sabo, huh? Dayton raised an eyebrow, you're that brat Ace talked about. Ace told me that you're an old hag. He smiled brightly at her as he spoke, a real man among men. I'm a woman. Oh, yeah? Well, you knowing about me makes this easier. Thank you for taking care of me from today. He took her hand in a handshake before she could stop him. He stepped back and she yelled, who said you could stay here? Neither Ace, Sabo or Luffy answered her verbally. All Sabo did was let out a fart. Don't answer with a fart. The three boys ignored her as they ran out of the building and into the forest. It was going to be a good day, they could just tell. Before they got too far, though, Sabo turned around and called, oh, yeah. Dayton. When she gave him her attention, he finished, we got a bit mixed up with Blue Jam's crew, so they might come by here. Then, he turned around and the boys ran further into the forest. It was a good few days for Luffy. He was getting to spend time with his brothers and he was able to push the last 2 years out of his mind for the time being. Before he knew it, Makino and Whoop Slap had come to the bandit hut to visit Luffy. She measured the three boys to make them some more clothes. When she was done, she made dinner for the bandits. Luffy completely forgot about Garp's surprise visit tonight. What did I tell you about spouting that pirate nonsense? Ace and Luffy froze when they heard his voice. I told you too that you're going to be Marines. He used trace amounts of hockey when he hit their heads, not enough to leave lasting damage, but enough to hurt them a bit. Then, he turned to the blonde boy, did you say something about being a pirate, too, squirt? Luffy decided to do as he had last time and make Sabo get hit, too. It was only fair. He's not a squirt. He's Sabo and we agreed that we're gonna all set out and become pirates when we're older. Garp gained a dangerous look in his eye as he said, oh. Then he hit Sabo's head, too, I'm not gonna let any of you become pirates. The three boys took that as their cue to run away. Art jazzed a 3 for about an hour before turning around and going back to the bandits' hut. Ace, Sabo and Luffy, however, continued to run until it started to rain. The boys decided to take shelter under the roots of a big tree. Comfortable with each other's warmth, the three fell asleep together, Ace on the left, Luffy in the middle and Sabo on the right. Luffy hadn't felt this peaceful in a long time. The morning came and the rainstorm left. Sabo was the first to awaken out of the three. Seeing the sky and the early morning sun, he crawled out of the small root cave they'd slept in. He stared at the tree for a long few minutes before an idea came to him. Pulling a piece of bark off of a nearby tree and a twig he dipped in mud, the blonde 10-year-old started to haphazardly draw the blueprints for a treehouse. When Ace and Luffy woke up, they crawled out of the cave and up to Sabo, who worked tirelessly on the blueprints. "What's that?" The 7-year-old pointed to the large piece of bark in question. "Our secret base." Sabo smiled proudly as he finished. Amazingly, all three boys could imagine the same thing. A wooden base high up in the branches of the large tree. They'd either make a rope ladder or carve footholds into the tree to get up. The small clearing they stood in would be filled with logs to sit on and a large campfire. The base itself would wrap halfway around the tree and have a crow's nest overlooking the whole island. It was perfect. Now, they had to build it. Luckily for them, Luffy picked up a few things from Frankie and Usopp, not that he'd ever tell them that. It took a little over a week for them to build and complete their secret base. Every night, they slept under the roots after having a campfire meal of whatever they caught and killed. Every morning, they went to the gray terminal after breakfast and gathered materials to build with. The rest of the day was spent building their base in the tree. By the end of the 8th day, they were ready to move in. So, they climbed the rope ladder up to the top and all climbed into the crow's nest. There, they tied a black piece of cloth with ASL painted on it in big white, surprisingly neat, letters. This was their forest, and this was their way of staking their claim on it. "It's beautiful," Sabo said as he stared out at the sea, his brothers joining his gaze. The sun wasn't setting yet, but the way it made the ocean sparkle with no breaks gave them all a sense of peace. "Luffy?" Ace called, "Man the sails." Despite every part of him that screamed "I'm the captain, you don't get to order me around." Luffy cheered, "Okay." Again, Ace yelled, "Sabo, take our heading." "Right." The boys played for the remaining hours of the day. It was refreshing for all three of them. Ace was finally able to act like a kid, Sabo didn't have to worry about his parents looming over him with responsibilities, and Luffy was able to return to simpler times. When the sun was almost below the horizon, the three boys collapsed on the floor of their now finished secret base and laughed. "I want this to last forever," Luffy said, almost asleep. He hadn't felt this relaxed and safe in a long time. "It won't be able to," Sabo sat up, "we're all gonna set out to be pirates, right? If we do, then we won't be able to play like this." "I know," the 7-year-old sighed as he let sleep overtake him, "but that doesn't mean I can't dream." When the smallest of the three fell asleep, the two 10-year-olds threw a blanket over him and moved to the crow's nest to talk. "There's something up with him," Ace said, Sabo agreed, "but what?" "I don't know." Sabo ruffled his hair in frustration. "He looks so lonely when he thinks we don't notice." "Why does he look like that?" Ace thought out loud, he said he doesn't have anyone else but Gramps, but the way he looks at the sea says differently. "Yeah," the blonde nodded, "and when I first went to stay with you guys," he took a piece of paper out of his hat. He noticed the look of confusion on his raven-haired friend's face, so he said, "It had numbers on it." So, that's probably a den number." "What's a den?" "Doesn't matter right now. Is it that dead snail thing we found a while back?" "Yes, but that's..." "Oh. Okay, I know what it is now. Listen." Sabo huffed, "If that is a den number, then there's somebody waiting for him to call. Which means, he's not alone." Ace's expression grew dark. That brat lied to him, them. How dare he? Standing, he jumped down before Sabo could stop him and went to wake Luffy up. But, he was caught off guard by the tears falling from the younger's eyes. "Ace?" Sabo hissed when he came up beside his fellow, "What's oh? Why is he crying?" "I don't know. He was so happy, earlier, why is he crying?" "I don't know, Sabo." Neither of them said anything for a long moment as they watched Luffy sleep. He didn't toss and turn, but he did bring a hand up to rest on the hat laying next to him. As if it was some sort of invisible hug, his tears slowed to a stop. The only thing that gave away his dream were the tear stains on his face. Just as the two older not yet brothers laid down on either side of the youngest, they heard him mumble out, "I'm sorry, please don't go." They didn't say anything as they fell asleep. They did come to a silent agreement to always protect him, though, lies be damned. The three hunted alligator for breakfast the next morning. Nothing was said about the two's discovery the previous night, and they planned to keep it like that. They knew that he probably didn't want to talk about it if he had, in fact, lied, so they didn't push the topic. Instead, Sabo suggested taking the alligator hide into town center to sell. With the promise of raiment from Ace, they got themselves a cloak and wagon and headed to the Goa Kingdom capital. Just as they entered Edge Town, some guys with knives leaked out of the shadows and surrounded the boys. "Hey, old man," one of them said, "you'll give us that gator skin and everything you have if you know what's good for you." Ace smirked from his place on Sabo's shoulders. "You guys should be a lot more careful about who you gang up on." Throwing off the cloak, the three brothers got in battle-ready positions, their metal pipes at the ready. "Shit." Another of the men yelled, the whole group backing away. "It's Ace and Sabo." Before the men could get away, the three beat them up and took any money they had on them. It wasn't much, but it would be added to their pirate fund. The two older boys didn't notice Luffy taking and hiding a knife in his pocket. That would come in handy at some point, Luffy thought. After they dusted themselves off, the boys restacked themselves, put the cloak back on, and continued on their way to sell the gator hide. At first, they were avoided like they had a plague. The nobles all covered their mouths and noses, as if scared to breathe the air around this new person. The boys were unfazed as they continued on their way. Eventually they found a shop that would take the gator skin. With more money in their pockets, Ace took his friends to a restaurant. "I'd like a private room, please." Of course, the man smiled. Then, he opened his eyes and got a look at his newest customer. "Wait. You can't come in here." Before Luffy could complain, Sabo held out his arm. "I'd like a private room." The shock on the man's face when he saw the engraving on the silver pendant almost made Luffy laugh. "Oh. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize you were a noble. Please, right this way." The boys followed after the man as he led them to the third floor and into a private room. Shortly after he left, a young girl came in and asked for an order. Sabo said he wants 3 orders of ramen. Without questioning it, the waitress bowed and left the room. "How'd you get us in?" Luffy asked. "Yeah," Ace agreed. "What was that you showed him?" Sabo rubbed the back of his head. "I found it in the trash. It looked important, so I grabbed it." He was glad when the two accepted his answer. It didn't take long for the lady to return with their ramen. They waited until she left before they dug in. "This is really good," Luffy exclaimed. Ace smiled, glad his youngest friend liked the meal. It didn't take long for the three to order more ramen. Every time the waitress came in, she didn't question anything. Either because of ignorance or fear, they didn't know, but were glad. They didn't know how they were going to explain their way out of it. Their 11th order of ramen came in, and Luffy didn't even try to hide his powers. Stretching his arms, he grabbed the tray for the waitress. Having never seen a devil fruit power, she screamed and ran out of the room. "But going, idiot." Ace scolded as the three practically inhaled their food. Just as they finished, the chef and the host ran into the room. "Time to go," was yelled, and the three boys grabbed their pipes and jumped out of the window, shattering it in the process. "Stop them," the host yelled from the window, "they're thieves." The boys only laughed as they ran down the street, dodging and weaving between people. They knew no one could catch up to them, but they didn't slow or stop. The only time they hesitated and looked back was when a man dressed in blue and a top hat called out to them. "Sabo." The man stared and the boys looked back at him. "Sabo. You're alive." He started to hurry after them as he yelled, "Come back home." "You know him?" Ace asked. Sabo shook his head. "No. He must be mistaking me for someone else." Neither raven-haired boy took the bait on this lie, but they didn't say anything as they continued to run out of town center. They slowed a bit as they left Edge Town, but they didn't stop moving until they were out of the Great Terminal. No one said a word as they made their way to the cliff where they'd officially become friends several weeks before. "Spill it," Ace said to Sabo the second they got to the cliff. "Who was that guy?" Sabo hesitated before he answered. Ace almost yelled at Luffy when he found out he might have lied. What would he do when he found out that Sabo had lied? "Well," the freckled boy tapped his foot. Sighing, Sabo accepted his fate. "I lied. I'm not an orphan of the Great Terminal. That man was my father." The blonde didn't look up as he continued. "I'm sorry I lied and said my parents were dead. I didn't want to go back there." "So?" Ace raised an eyebrow. "I'm the son of a noble." Sabo yelled. "Who is?" Luffy tilted his head. "I am." The tears were now gone from his eyes. He wasn't scared that his friend of 6 years would leave anymore. "So? That doesn't matter." When Ace said that, Sabo was filled with relief. He wasn't mad at him for lying. Ace looked both of his not-yet brothers in the eye and said, "Listen. When we set out, I'm gonna make a name for myself. I'm gonna be known by everyone throughout the entire world." Sabo, kind of understanding what was going on, followed up with, "I'm gonna travel the entire world when I set out and write a book about my adventures." Luffy smiled at his not-yet brothers. Then, he ran to the edge of the cliff with a hand on his hat and yelled, "I'm gonna be the king of the pirates." He'd done it once before, he was gonna do it again. This time, with a lot less fighting and war and bloodshed. Ace and Sabo started to laugh when they got over their surprise. "Yeah, sure. You sure are a weird kid." The three continued to laugh with each other for a few minutes before Sabo brought up a good point. "It's fine that we all want to become pirates, but we can't all be the captain." Ace nodded. "I had planned on you being my navigator, Sabo." "No." Luffy yelled, "You guys need to be on my ship." He knew they'd never join his crew and he was admittedly glad for that. He loves his brothers, but they can be very protective sometimes. Also, he wouldn't have had nearly as much fun with his crew if Ace and Sabo had been looming over him the whole time. "What?" the two yelled, as if. Luffy only laughed. He knew this would happen, but it didn't change a thing. He wasn't angry they had decided to go elsewhere. The places they ended up made them better than being together ever could have. Luffy woke up between his brothers the next morning, Ace's left arm under his head as a pillow, and Sabo's right arm holding the blanket up on his chest. It was weird, they never acted like this last time, not even after they became brothers. It was strange, but comforting. Closing his eyes, he went back to sleep. The memories of the last few weeks playing on repeat. Ace woke up soon after Luffy fell asleep again. He carefully moved his arm out from under the 7-year-old's head and gave his not-yet brothers his blanket. Then, he quietly moved around the secret base and gathered a few things. After claiming down, he ran to the cliff where they declared their dreams the day before and put the red cups he'd stolen on a stump near the edge of the clearing. The last thing he did for preparations was run to Dayton's hut and steal an unopened bottle of sake. He left it at the cliff before returning to the base just before the other two woke up. When they did, he had them follow him to their cliff. "What are you on about, Ace?" Sabo yawned. Ignoring his friend's question, Ace simply laid out the 3 cups in a triangle. "Did you know that when men share a drink, they become brothers?" Realization hit Luffy and a grin split his face as he picked up his Sakazuki cup, Sabo doing the same. Ace poured a bit of sake in each of the 3 cups. Together, they lifted their drinks. "From now on," Ace announced with a smile, "even if we end up on different ships, we're brothers." The 3 clinked their cups together before drinking. They would all remember this vow, no matter what. Finishing their drinks, the 3 nearly gagged as the liquid burned their throats. Luffy had never liked the taste of alcohol, and this was one of the only times he'd ever drink it. Any other time someone would offer, he'd turn it down. Even if his crew all had a high alcohol tolerance, they could drink themselves under tables if they wanted, and someone needed to be awake and alert. Besides, he'd seen hangovers before and he did not want to go through that. "I wonder where we'll end up going from here?" Sabo said from beside Luffy, the 3 now laying on their backs in the grass. "I don't know," Ace said, "but I'm not gonna take orders from anyone." Luffy almost laughed. In the middle of the relaxed atmosphere, Sabo decided to ask what had been weighing on his mind for a few days. "Luffy. When I first went to stay with you and Ace, I saw you take a piece of paper from your hat. What's that about?" Luffy stiffened, noticed by his brothers, before he relaxed and answered, "Shanks' den number. He said to call him when I set off because he has something for me." Both older boys bought it and let the matter drop. Then, it was Ace's turn to speak. "You keep mentioning this Shanks guy, who is he?" A proud look entered Luffy's eyes as he spoke. "He saved my life." His hand went to his left arm where he knew Shanks was missing, and he inspired my dream. He thought for a second before he added, "He told me he was a cabin boy on Gold Roger's ship, too." Ace froze at this little tidbit of information. His kid brother knows the cabin boy on his father's ship. Impossible. The whole crew was rumored to have died after Gold Roger disbanded it. But, Luffy can't lie to save his life, literally, so he must be telling the truth. This is too confusing. "Really?" Sabo asked. Maybe, if Luffy knows someone from Roger's crew, then he could change Ace's opinion of himself. Sabo didn't know what he would do if he had to watch a bar full of drunks unknowingly insult Ace right to his face again. "Yeah." Shanks said that Captain Roger was the best captain he could have ever asked for. Luffy knew what Sabo was doing and what was going through Ace's head, but he didn't care either way. He normally doesn't get the chance to gush about his hero and his captain, so he was gonna take this opportunity and roll with it. He could read a weird language that no one else could, and they had parties all the time. The 3 boys sat in a circle as Luffy continued. Shanks said that Captain Roger and Captain Whitebeard got into a fight once, and that they didn't even cross blades before their raw power exploded. The 2 10-year-olds could practically feel the admiration Luffy held as he spoke. Who it was for, they didn't know. Ace hoped that none of that was towards his father, though. No matter how much anyone tried to change his mind, he would always hate his father. Sabo, on the other hand, was happy to hear about another side to Roger. It was refreshing to hear about the former pirate king from someone who obviously doesn't hate him, even if it's from a second-hand source. Both older boys noticed that Luffy always referred to Gold Roger as Captain Roger, and not anything else. Not even Shanks was referred to as Captain. If Captain Roger had a kid, Luffy said, catching both of his brothers' attention, I would want to meet them. I bet they'd be really strong and really fun to hang out with. He stood up and walked to the edge of the cliff, not once looking at his brothers. I'd want to share a drink with them. No one spoke for a long few minutes. Luffy was still staring out at the setting sun, lost in the stories Shanks and Rile had told him about their captain. Ace and Sabo, on the other hand, were staring at Luffy. Now they for sure knew there was something weird about Luffy. There was no way that he could know who Ace's father was, so did he say all of it just because? It baffled them. Sabo decided he didn't want to let Ace fall down that dangerous rabbit hole they both knew so well. But when he turned to shake Ace out of his thoughts, he found a small tear falling from his brother's eye. Sabo just looked back at Luffy. Whatever had compelled him to say that obviously was right. When the sun had fully set, Luffy finally turned to face his brothers. To his surprise, they had both fallen asleep. Smiling with a look he started to wear 2 years before traveling through time, he carefully picked up his older brothers and walked back to their secret base. He laid them in the cave under the roots before climbing up and grabbing a few blankets. Then, he went back to the cliff and grabbed the Sakazuki cups and the sake so he could put them in their secret base. Again, he looked out at the sea and a song Brook used to sing came to his mind. Cruel and cold, like winds of the seas, you will never return to me. Hear my voice, sing with the tide. Our love will never die. The story behind the song was explained to him once by Robin. It made him sad when he first heard it, but he didn't really feel too bad for the guy. Davy Jones was apparently a bad man. Over waves and deep in the blue, I will give up my heart for you. Then long years, I'll wait to go by, our love will never die. Come, my love, be one with the sea, rule with me for eternity. Drown all dreams so mercilessly and leave their souls to me. He didn't really understand that line, even after Robin had explained it to him. When he asked Jin what it meant, he explained that Davy Jones had become a pirate in order to escape the authorities. Apparently, according to the fishman, he wanted someone to rule the seas with him until the end of time. Again, Luffy asked what he meant and Jin asked him if he believed in the legend of the Fountain of Youth. Play the song you sang long ago. And wherever the storm may blow, you will find the key to my heart, we'll never be apart. Wild and strong, you can't be contained. Never bound, nor ever chained. Wounds you cause will never mend, and you will never end. No one gave him an answer when he asked what that line meant, so he gave up on trying to figure it out. Maybe Captain Whitebeard would know. Cruel and cold, like winds on the seas, you will never return to me. Hear my voice and sing with the tide, our love will never. Luffy realized that he had made it back to the secret base and that his brothers were now listening to him, die. I didn't peg you as a singer. Ace commented after a second of silence. Luffy blushed and launched his arm up to hoist himself into the secret base. He was so embarrassed. He didn't think they'd be awake when he got back. He was hoping they'd sleep through until tomorrow morning. Hey. Sabo smiled as his head popped into Luffy's view. The said raven-haired boy had curled himself in a nest of blankets in the corner after putting the cups and drink down near the window. You know, me and Ace haven't ever heard someone sing like that. Where'd you learn? Luffy didn't answer. He can't lie, and he didn't want to tell the truth because Shanks and Marco said not to, so he stayed silent. Though, when he meets his brothers when he sets sail, he'll gladly tell them that Brook was the one who taught him to sing. Luffy would tell his brothers that his skeletal musician got tired of Luffy singing out of key and worked him to the bone to get him to sing properly. Pun obviously intended. Sabo sighed when he didn't get an answer and crawled closer to his younger brother. Hey, he said, did Shanks and his crew teach you that song? Knew who? Luffy shook his head. Ace then climbed up and threw more blankets on the pile Luffy was buried in. What songs did they teach you? Luffy wasn't sure how to feel about this new development. While he loves the attention his brothers were giving him this time, it wasn't what he remembered and he didn't know what to do. He figured he'd have to call Shanks or Mihawk and ask them about it. But, he answered his brother's question, they really only taught me one song called Bink's Ache. The rest, I heard them singing and just kinda picked them up. The blonde leaned his back against a pile of blankets and pulled one off for himself. Do you know any other songs? I've heard a couple from the villagers in Fuchsia, yeah. Why? You should sing one. A said, also pulling a blanket for himself and leaning against a pile. Luffy was about to deny him, but quickly changed his mind. There's not a lot that his brothers ever praised him for, so if they liked his singing enough to compliment it, then he was gonna make Brook a proud teacher. He opened his mouth and started to quietly sing, oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the roses falling, it's you must go and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow or when the valleys hush are white with snow. It's I'll be here in sunshine or in shadow. Oh, Danny boy, I love you so. He listened for a second to see if his brothers were asleep. When Sabo asked if that was all, he continued, but when ye come and all the flowers are dying, if I am dead, as dead I well may be, you'll come and find the place where I am laying and kneel and say an avenue for me. And I shall hear, though soft you tread above me, and all my grave will warmer, sweeter be, for you will bend and tell me that you love me. And I shall sleep in peace until you come to me. This time, his brothers were actually asleep. Luffy hadn't had anyone to sing to or with in a while, so singing to his brothers brought a tear to his eye. Quietly, he hummed the song to himself as he, too, fell asleep. Chapter 3. Reliving childhood. Nothing happened for a while after the three swore themselves as brothers. They had fallen into a pattern, though, during the night. After dinner, they would play a game or two before turning in to go to sleep. Ace would lay on the right, Luffy in the middle, and Sabo on the left. Then, Ace and Sabo would ask Luffy to sing for them. He usually sang Danny Boy, but would sometimes sing other songs. He debated whether or not to teach his brothers the songs, but decided not to. He's not a good listener, so he didn't think he'd be able to teach very well. It wasn't until months later that something happened. They had been hunting for their dinner and came back with a dampa. It was Luffy's first ever solo catch. He decided to not risk his brothers finding out about the whole time travel thing by suddenly being a lot stronger than they thought him to be, and they were all going back to celebrate. But, the Tiger Lord decided it wanted Luffy's catch, so it cornered them. They had no choice but to give it their dinner, but none of them were happy about it. Sneaking away from the large tiger posed to be a problem when Luffy stepped on a twig which made them noticeable. Together, the three screamed and ran into the forest, the Tiger Lord hot on their trail. Luffy, who had been working on his observation haki in secret, intentionally led his brothers to where he could sense someone. He remembered that the old pirate Naguri had saved him and his brothers the last time he did this. The three ran past the old man, and Ace and Sabo swung around to warn the old man of the incoming danger. Luffy just hid behind the man. When Naguri saw the boys, he guessed that the large footfalls he'd heard had been chasing them. The one in the straw hat had seemed to know he was here. Naguri idly noted that he was showing signs of observation haki. Without saying a word, the old man lifted his hand with his palm towards the incoming danger and said, "Stop." Ace, Sabo and Luffy all showed their amazement at what he'd done. The Tiger Lord stopped in its tracks because this guy told it to. Amazing. What were you three doing to provoke the Tiger Lord? Naguri asked the three boys when he turned to face them after the Tiger Lord left. Luffy was the first one to speak up. Nothing. She stole our dinner, and when we tried to get away, I stepped on a twig and she started to chase after us. Naguri raised an eyebrow at how the boy had referred to the Tiger Lord as female according to this kid, but said nothing of it. Instead, he chuckled and invited the three boys to eat dinner with him. They accepted and he led them to where he was living. Hey. Sabo realized about halfway through their meal, "You're Naguri." "Who?" Ace and Luffy asked. "Naguri. He lives in the Grey Terminal and is always carting off really random stuff." The blonde explained. "Really?" Luffy considered the information for less than a second before saying, "Cool." Naguri chuckled at the three boys. They were entertaining to say the least. Somewhere in the conversation, though none of them could tell you when, the subject of pirates came up. That's when Naguri revealed his former occupation. "I even challenged the Pirate King, once upon a time." Ace stiffened as Luffy asked for the story. About halfway through the tale, Ace stood up and left. "What's up with him?" Luffy asked just after his brother was out of earshot. Sabo sighed. He really didn't want to tell anyone, it wasn't their business. But, he figured it would come out sooner or later. Gold Roger is Ace's dad. The blonde was silent as he waited for any words of hate from either of them, though he doubted Luffy held anything but respect for the man. "Really?" Luffy yelled, although he already knew this information. "That's so cool." Sabo quickly shushed him. "You can't bring this up around Ace, okay? I wasn't supposed to tell you. Besides, he hates his father." Luffy only hummed. The two thanked Naguri for both the meal and helping them with the Tiger Lord before they hiked back through the snow and to their secret base. Thinking about it, I can see the resemblance between them, they're a lot alike personality-wise. "Is that why he asked me if I wanted him to live?" Luffy asked halfway back home. Sabo nodded. He has a bad habit of asking people what they would do if Gold Roger had a son. No matter how many times I tell him not to, he refuses to listen to me. Luffy grabbed Sabo's hand as they walked, "Then we'll just have to change his mind." He looked up at the sky when reached the edge of the clearing. "I stand by what I said before, though. He's really fun to be around." "You are, too." Sabo smiled as he watched Luffy start to climb the tree. "That kid." Shaking his head, he followed after him. "Hi Ace." Luffy greeted his brother the second he got to the top. "Sabo told me why you hate Captain Roger so much." Luffy didn't let Ace interrupt him as he spoke. "You remember what I said the day we became brothers, right?" When Ace nodded he continued, aware that Sabo was now up there with them. "I stand by what I said that day. You're really fun to be around. And I don't care how many people deny it, you've got the coolest dad ever." Turning away from the window, Luffy went up into the crow's nest after greeting Sabo. Ace said nothing as he listened to the other two moving around behind him. He heard Luffy climb up to the crow's nest with a blanket while Sabo started to get himself ready for bed. "You really think he means it?" the raven-haired boy asked the blonde. "Yeah," was his answer, "and I stand with him on this matter. You're great to be around. Yeah, your dad is pretty cool, but I don't expect you to change your mind about him. Just know that you keep asking the wrong people about him." His crew and friends and allies are all out there, waiting for someone to ask about their captain. Sabo sighed as he laid down. Will you call Luffy down? He'll get sick if he stays up there too long. Ace nodded and did as told. Luffy didn't mean to change the way this turned out, but he didn't think he would have been able to handle what was said last time. He could hear Sabo talking to Ace, probably confirming what he'd just said. He was glad he could return and try again. Now, he just had to get a hold of a Den Mushi and call Shanks or Mihawk. Luffy? Ace called up to him. Sabo says it's time to go to sleep. Giving one last glance to the stars, Luffy wrapped the blanket tighter around himself before climbing back down. He didn't say anything as he laid down between his brothers. He didn't even make a sound when they asked if he was alright. After a long moment, he spoke in an almost whisper. Don't tell Grandpa. He gained their attention with that one sentence, but I found a wanted poster in the newspaper a bit after Shanks left. He turned onto his stomach so he wouldn't have to face the other two. I thought it was a coincidence, but something Gramps told me made me think otherwise. He let himself fall into a pseudo-sleep after he finished. If you thought your dad was bad for being hunted by the Marines, try having a dad at the top of the world's most wanted list. He felt both older boys sit up faster than a blink at the information he let spill. Luffy went back to where Naguri lived the next morning. He had waited for his brothers to be slightly awake to tell them he was leaving. He had found that little bridge over his lying problem a while ago. If the person or people are awake enough to open their eyes, then he isn't lying when he says you were awake when I told you. Whether they are capable of cognitive thought when he tells them or not is not his problem. What are you doing back here? Naguri asked when he saw the straw hat wearing child arrive near his home. I want to help you. Help me? With what? You're gathering stuff, right? I don't have any proof, but I think you're building something. I want to help you build it. Naguri laughed more than he had in a while. This kid definitely knew more than he let on. Fine, kid, but I don't like owing people. What do you want in return? Aside for some help with my mystery power, Naguri raised an eyebrow. Do you have a Den Mushi thing? A friend gave me a number and told me to look for one of those things. The old man smiled to himself and said, I think I can help with the mystery power of yours. The Den, though, I can't. At least, not right now. Luffy smiled brightly at the old man. He was gonna help him with observation haki. He didn't want to perfect the power this early on, just get good enough at it to prevent a few unnecessary injuries in the future. He'd let Riley teach him haki officially. Hopefully, he'd get to that point under a lot better circumstances this time around. Naguri led Luffy to a nearby cave down by the shore of his camp. Inside, there was a mostly built ship held up on some logs, just above the water. The gangplank was lowered to allow the two on. Happily, Luffy grabbed a hammer and some nails and followed Naguri to where he could put him to work for the morning. Luffy agreed to work until Naguri could figure out how to train him. It wasn't until midday that Ace and Sabo showed up at Naguri's camp where the two were having lunch. Luffy. They yelled as they tackled him in a hug. We thought you ran away. Why didn't you tell us you were leaving or where you were going? Luffy swallowed his food and then answered, but I did tell you. Just after you woke up I told you I was gonna come ask Naguri to help me get stronger. It's not my fault you guys didn't listen. Neither older boy could deny it. Though neither of them remembered, Luffy couldn't be lying because he can't lie. However, Luffy being able to wiggle himself around lying like that was a scary thought, almost as bad as the thought of Luffy being able to lie. How are you training him, Naguri? Sabo asked the old man, sitting down on Luffy's right. Can we join in? Ace tacked on as he sat on Luffy's left. He would ask Luffy about what he said last night later. The prospect of getting stronger was a more pressing matter. Naguri regarded the three before nodding, but I don't want you two owing me anything. You have to help me build something as my condition, okay? The two boys nodded and the group of four headed down to the shore. There, the boys were briefed on what they would be doing and the training began. The boys worked tirelessly for the next 2 weeks. Every morning, they would wake up at dawn and hunt down breakfast as they headed to help Naguri. After breakfast with the old man, they would get to work on the ship. Just before lunch, Naguri would go to the Great Terminal to get more materials while the boys went to catch lunch. After lunch, they'd work on observation haki. Then, they would catch and eat dinner together before splitting off. The training was solely observation training. Naguri wasn't sure if the older boys could use that type of haki, but made them go through the training just in case. It was the right decision. He drilled memorization into the three's heads before doing anything else. If the two 10-year-olds couldn't use observation haki yet, then they'd at least have a good head start with this. After memory drills, he had them blindfolded and he'd attack them at random. Luffy, for reasons only he knew, was miraculous with this and picked it up within a few days and was able to do it while moving around. Ace and Sabo, on the other hand, could not and were frustrated that Luffy was better at something than them. Their frustration was overtaken by amusement every time their little brother got hit or knocked down. At the end of 2 weeks, the four found themselves back on the shoreline and admiring their finished project. In front of them was the boat they'd been working on. The three boys hadn't done much with it in the grand scheme, but their help had made the building process quicker. The old man had found himself slowing down recently and losing motivation. The three boys, however, had re-sparked something in him and pushed him to finish what he started. It took 10 whole years, Naguri whipped a tear from his eye as he spoke, but I'm finally setting my sails again. He walked across the gangplank, leaving the three boys on the dry land to let the ship off of the logs. I hope you boys remember what I taught you over the past 2 weeks. He yelled and pulled the gangplank onto the ship, let the logs go. Ace, Sabo and Luffy pulled on a rope and the logs holding the ship above the water gave away. They watched in amazement and awe as the ship cruised out of the cavern and into the open ocean waters. They waved to the renewed captain as he took his cloak off with flair and tied it to the top of the main mast. Luffy yelled, I hope to meet you on the open ocean someday. Despite his saying this, he knew he never would. The old man either never left the East Blue or died on the sea. Either way, Luffy respected the old man and would give him a proper funeral at sea after his brothers left the island. It's only fair. Hey Luffy. Naguri called just before he was out of earshot, look in the logs around the fire. Luffy nodded, not able to respond to the man before he was out of sight. What's in the logs? Ace asked his younger brother. The younger raven-haired boy shrugged and ran off to the campfire. Whatever it was must have been meant for him alone. It was a surprise. Oh, Luffy loved surprises, no matter how old and war-hardened he got. As long as they were good surprises, though, and not too loud. Loud noises are scary. The three got to the campfire and started to look inside of the log sitting around it. After a few seconds, Sabo called out to the other two and held up a bag with Luffy's name on it. The youngest opened the bag and smiled. It's a Den Den thingy. Luffy cried as he pulled it out of the bag for his older brothers to see. The Den Den mushi was just a standard Den Den that could be bought in every big town. Its body was light blue and it had a wheat-colored shell. The thing was softly snoring, clearly in working order and waiting to be used. There was a piece of paper that Luffy had Sabo read to him. It says, I hope you find what you're looking for, kid. Take this on your adventures with you and give me a proper boss when you set out. I have the feeling you know what that means, so I won't explain it. The number is XXXXX. When he finished reading, Sabo handed the paper back to Luffy who had taken the red ribbon off of the bag and was trying to attach it to the Den Den's shell. What a nice guy. I hope to meet him again someday. Ace nodded. Hey, he asked, what does boss mean? Sabo was also confused, so they both looked at Luffy who had successfully attached a red ribbon around the base of the Den Den's shell. Luffy answered without looking at them, Luckyru told me that it means burial at sea. I don't know why he'd want me to do it, though. Besides, he's gonna live a long life. The boy put the sleeping Den Den back in the bag and stood up, leading the way back to their tree home. The other two looked at each other and followed after their little brother. Winter went by uneventfully. The Den Den was put on a new shelf they'd put next to their Sakazuki cups and was left to sleep. At some point, the still mostly full bottle of sake was put on the shelf as well, but no one complained. The number for the Den Den was written down and nailed to the wall just above it, the letter Naguri wrote under the Den Den. It was spring and the boys were walking through the forest and to the great terminal. Luffy had been wondering since before he set out the first time which one of his brothers was older, so he decided to ask. Ace. Sabo. Which one of you is older? The two older boys looked at each other and shrugged. They'd never really thought about it and they told Luffy so. Oh. He was silent for another few minutes before he followed up with another question. Ace. What day were you born? Ace hesitated, having to think about it before answering, January 1st. Why? Luffy took in the knowledge before asking Sabo the same question. What about you, Sabo? Sabo also hesitated, but only because he realized that Ace was 2 months and 29 days older than him. March 30th. Ace grew a smirk at the information, and Luffy just hummed. His crew usually made sure to celebrate birthdays, but he didn't really see the need. Maybe it's because he grew up not celebrating birthdays, so he didn't make a huge deal of the knowledge. He just wanted to know which of his brothers was the oldest and which one would be leaving the soonest. Because Sabo had left the island early last time, Ace chose to leave later in the year in his honor, though neither of them knew Sabo's birthday at the time. What about you, Luffy? Sabo pushed Ace's teasing away. When's your birthday? Gramp said May 5th. Luffy answered. They left the discussion alone as they continued to travel through Middle Forest. We should find some good stuff to repair the base when we get there. Ace brought up, just in case of a storm. I think that's the first time you've had a good idea. Sabo teased his brother. He would never admit that Ace is older than him, never. Hey. I have good ideas all the time. He defended, I just don't tell you guys because you'd be too stupid to understand them. Luffy nodded sarcastically, whatever you say. They all laughed together as they emerged out of the forest. That's when a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. "Sabo," he said quietly. He recognized this feeling, and he doesn't like this as the same feeling he got just hours before the first member of his crew was killed. Sabo. Finally, the two older brothers registered the sense of urgency in their younger brother's voice and started to panic. He never sounded like this. "What's wrong?" the blonde asked. I think we should head back." Damn it, he thought he'd gotten rid of that stutter years ago. "I've got a really bad feeling about being here." Ace didn't look as worried. "Don't worry, we can protect you, Lou. It's not me." The panicked feeling rose as he saw Blue Jam's goons further off near the wall. "Something really bad is gonna happen here soon. I don't want to be here, I don't want you guys to be here, I don't even want Dayton near here." Sabo looked at Ace nervously. He knew that Luffy wasn't looking down on them, but Luffy was implying that they couldn't do anything about whatever was going to happen, and Ace was not going to take that well. "Ace," he said before the older could rant about being strong enough, "I've never seen him like this, and I doubt you have either. Let's go and come back when Lou's less freaked out." Ace wasn't happy about it, but he agreed. He picked up Sabo and Luffy's pipes, and Sabo picked up Luffy who had started to cry. He didn't like leaving the promise of a challenge, but Luffy was so freaked out that he was crying, and that was strange. Luffy's a crybaby, yes, but he hadn't cried since that night they caught him crying in his sleep. He quickly took up the rear of the small line as they hurried away from the great terminal. The further away they got, the more Luffy calmed down. Eventually, he fell asleep in Sabo's arms. When they got back to their secret base, Sabo put Luffy on his back and tied his arms so he wouldn't fall off. Carefully, he climbed up the rope ladder and into the building. Gently, he placed Luffy on the pile of blankets in the corner and covered him up with his blue tailcoat. "I wonder what got him so freaked out," he said when Ace pulled up the ladder and closed the trapdoor. "I don't know," Ace responded, "but I hope there isn't a storm anytime soon. If there is, we'll have to go stay with Dayton. We don't have enough materials to fix this place up after a storm." Sabo hummed in response and sat next to his younger brother. "It'll have to do for now. I think that whatever got Lou so freaked out is gonna be big." "How big do you think?" "Big enough to see it from here." And wasn't that an unsettling thought? A week and 3 days passed by and the boys didn't go anywhere near the great terminal. On the last day, the sinking feeling appeared for Ace and Sabo. Together, they ran as fast as they could to the bandit hut, only to stop short and hide up in the branches of a tree. "We're looking for this kid," the man said. "Have you seen him?" The group were all in protective white suits with glass helmets and were obviously from town center. By that information alone, it was obvious they were looking for Sabo. "Yeah, I've seen him," Dayton answered, and Sabo nearly swore. "He left the island with the Marines a while ago, said it was his dream to become an admiral." "He told you?" "Why?" another of the men asked. "He stayed here for about a year before the Marines came by to pick him up." Dayton took a drawl of her cigarette before she finished her story. "Course, that was about 4 years ago." "Ha!" one of the men yelled, "a hole in your lie. He's been missing for 7 years now." Dayton, however, didn't miss a beat. "I said he stayed here for a while, not the whole time. He could have been living in the great terminal or even in the forest in the 2 years before coming to me. There's also the possibility that he was staying with a different group of mountain bandits." The men clicked their tongues and left to go back to the kingdom. If the brat wasn't on the island anymore, then they can't do anything about it. Luffy, in the back of his mind, realized that the group didn't mention anything about Sabo being sighted in town center within the last year. The brothers made sure that the group were long gone before jumping out of the tree and going into the hut. They didn't even knock before they entered. "Hey!" they yelled in greeting. "Boys," Dayton screamed. She wasn't expecting them to come back ever. "We came to warn you, but I think half the warning just left." Ace glared in the direction the men had gone. "Nobles, disgusting." "Warn us?" Dogra asked. "Warn us of what?" Sabo watched as Luffy ran around the main room before running to their old room. "Something bad is gonna happen tonight. We don't know what it is, but it's been bothering Luffy for a little over a week now. It's only been bothering me and Ace for about a day, but we thought we should warn you guys." "Why's a feeling got you so worked up?" Dayton asked. "It's not really the feeling that freaked us out," Ace told them, now sitting across from Dayton and Magra, Dogra having gone to keep Luffy occupied. "What freaked us out was the way Luffy reacted." The two raised an eyebrow and Ace continued, "We went to the great terminal, but before we could even get out of Middle Forest, Luffy freaked out and said something bad was gonna happen. We haven't gone close to the great terminal since." Sabo picked up the explanation. "We figured we should come tell you guys to stay away from the great terminal until we figure out what it is that set us off like this." The two bandits went over the information in their heads. Luffy was set off a week ago by a feeling something bad was going to happen, and now Ace and Sabo have the same feeling. Dayton normally doesn't trust anyone that's not a part of her family, but these brats had wormed their way into her heart, not that she'd ever tell them that. These kids are strange, and normally that means they're gonna have a few surprises up their sleeves. Alright, date inside, I'll believe you and pass on the warning to the others as soon as she was cut off by the front door slamming open. Boss, the bandit yelled as he ran into the room, catching everyone's attention. The great terminal. It's burning. What? Every person in the hut jumped up and ran outside. The sky above where they knew the great terminal to be was clouded over with black smoke. The reds and oranges of the roaring fire made the smoke seem darker than it was. Luffy glared at the smoke-filled sky. It left a nasty stench in the air, and it took every ounce of mental strength not to show he could smell it from where they were. He was glad, however, that no one he cared about was in the fire this time. He and Ace hadn't been caught up with Blue Jam's crew, and Sabo was still with them. All was good, for the moment. Though, Luffy had no idea how these changes would affect the timeline moving on. He pushed the thought to the back of his mind and instead thought about how to talk to Shanks or Mihawk. Luffy? Ace and Sabo yelled, pulling the boy out of his thoughts. You okay, bud? The blonde had his hands on the Raven's shoulders, a look of concern in his eyes. Luffy nodded, but didn't say anything. You sure? Ace asked, oddly gentle. You were staring pretty hard at the smoke over there. Then, he seemed to realize something. Are you scared of fire? At Luffy's flinch, the two older boys pulled him into a hug before moving him into the hut. He wasn't scared of fire as much as he was magma. The basic principles of the two were the same, though. We're staying here until the fire and smoke clear. The oldest stated as the three went into their old room. The night passed uneventfully at the bandit hut. Everyone was warned not to go to the great terminal or even go further than 3 miles from the house until the smoke was cleared. And even then, no one was to go there until a scouting party was sent to determine if it was safe or not. Luffy rolled over in his place in between his brothers. He needs to call Shanks. But the Den Mushi was back at the treehouse. Sighing, Luffy closed his eyes and tried to go to sleep. It didn't work. Every time he closed his eyes, he was reminded of how Ace was killed by magma, how Sabo was almost killed by fire before eventually dying by drowning, how Usopp died being stabbed, how Robin was killed by an explosion, how Frankie and Brook were killed by being drowned with the Sunny, how Chopper and Nami were shot and killed while distracting their enemies, how Sanji had disappeared, how Jin was killed by a fellow fishman who was stuck in the mindset that all humans are evil, and any fishman who helps them is not a fellow, how Zoro bled to death after protecting Luffy from a fellow swordsman and captain. Luffy sat upright between his brothers, breathing fast. He didn't know when he'd fallen asleep, but he knew he'd been out for a few hours at least. He had his pointer and middle finger over the pulse point in his left wrist to try and calm himself down. He didn't register that both of his brothers were trying to get his attention. When he got function back into his limbs, he abruptly stood up and ran out of the hut. He threw up after running a few feet into the underbrush. Blue? Sabo came up behind him cautiously, as if he was addressing a scared animal. Ace came up with Sabo and rubbed Luffy's back. What's wrong, Lou? Luffy wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before turning and grabbing both of his brothers in a hug, his rubber arms wrapping around them several times. He was scared that this was all a dream, despite knowing it's not, and that his older brothers would disappear if he let them go. Neither older boy complained about the hug. They knew how much Luffy craved and cherished physical attention. Instead, they looked at each other and nodded. Then, they led the youngest back to sit against the side of the bandit hut. They didn't make Luffy let go at any point and just held him. It was way earlier than they normally woke up, but they were too concerned to be tired. What could have possibly made their youngest brother react like this? Then, it hit them. The fire. The fire obviously uncovered something in his memories. What it was, they had no idea, nor did they have any plans to ask about it yet. Ace? Luffy whispered from where he lay across both boys' laps. Sabo? Hearing the quiet call, the two looked at their youngest brother. His head was laying on Sabo's lap and his torso and legs were curled on Ace's legs. His right hand was stretched from under him to hold his eldest brother's hand, while his left hand held his other older brother's pants in a vice grip under his head. Can I ask you something? He looked so vulnerable at the moment and he knew he did, but he didn't care. He never fully developed mentally and being in a child's body again was messing with him. He couldn't think coherently and there was something taking over for him as he spoke. This feeling, though, was warm and comforting. It was kind of like when he first used Gear 5 and learned the truth of his devil fruit. Though the warmth was a lot more comforting this time. Go ahead, Lou. Ace prompted, his hand never stopping its motion of rubbing the younger Raven's back. You guys aren't gonna forget about me, right? As if sensing their apprehension, he continued, I know we're all gonna leave the island and that you guys are gonna leave before me, but you won't forget about me, right? I don't know what I would do if you guys left and forgot about me. I don't know what I would do if you guys left me all alone forever. Sabo's hand froze for a second before he continued to pet Luffy's hair. What brought this on? He asked. The fire at the great terminal. The older two shared a look. I don't like fire. He was silent for a few hours after that, all three just sitting and listening to what was going on around them. At some point, Dogra had come out and given them some food, but they didn't eat it right away. When the sun was right above them, Luffy spoke again. "I had a nightmare last night. Sabo was taken back by his father, and Blue Jam tricked me and Ace into helping him put explosives around the Great Terminal. Then, they trapped us and wouldn't let us escape. But then Dayton and the rest showed up and helped us out. But Ace didn't want to run, so Dayton stayed behind to help him. They didn't come back for a while. When they did come back, though, they were hurt pretty badly. And then Dogra came back and said that a boat was pulling into the Goa Kingdom harbor. Then he said a fishing boat sailed out flying a black flag and was shot by the big boat. He said that Sabo was on the boat and was killed by some guy called a celestial dragon. He sniffled, aware that his brothers were staring at him. Luffy knew he shouldn't be telling them about what would have happened if he hadn't refused to go near the Great Terminal all week, but he couldn't help it. He briefly considered the thought of telling them about Ace's death, but he decided to leave it. He'd have to call one of the Den numbers he'd been given before telling them anything else. There's supposed to be a storm tonight," Sabo said after a few false starts. He was understandably shaken up about the nightmare his younger brother had just shared. Ace scattered and grabbed the food that had been left for them a while ago. "Nothing we can do about it. All we can do is hope that our base doesn't get too damaged." Sniffling, Luffy sat up and joined his brothers in eating the meal. Though, he ate a noticeably smaller amount of food than normal. But, it was understandable considering the boy had thrown up only hours beforehand and was still obviously affected by the nightmare. The question weighing on Ace and Sabo's minds now was what had brought up the fear of them forgetting about him. Why would he ever think they could forget about him? They may have only become a trio a little under a year ago, but they could never forget the time they spent together, not even if it killed them. Once the food was completely gone, the three boys continued to sit in each other's company. They didn't need to speak to one another in order to feel comfortable, and it was nice to just sit for once. Neither of the older two could tell when exactly the bond between them had developed to that extent, but they weren't complaining. Far from it, actually. Now that they'd spent a bit of time with their youngest brother, they couldn't imagine a life without him. By the time the sun set, the bandit's dog, Pachi, had curled around Luffy and was giving the three boys a dog's equivalent to a purr. It was this scene that Dayton came upon when she came to give the boys some dinner. It wasn't much, but no one had been out to hunt for the day. She didn't have the heart to wake the boys, so she took the food and gave it to her bandits. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.